I support the Second Amendment, but you don't. The word but is a subtle yet powerful conjunction. According to dictionary.com, it can mean on the contrary, except, or unless. Urban Dictionary cuts to the chase with definitions like to delay the inevitable, or a word used to nullify all the words preceding the sentence. When someone says, I support the Second Amendment, but you know they're about to contradict or diminish their supposed support. It's a telltale sign that they don't fully grasp the unyielding nature of the Second Amendment. They're about to impose their own subjective conditions on a constitutional right, just like the anti-self-defense movement, ASDM. Let's break this down. If you believe in the Second Amendment, you should understand that it comes with a very specific, non-negotiable clause, shall not be infringed. This wording doesn't leave room for qualifications, restrictions, or compromises. The meaning of infringed? Webster's, to wrongly limit or restrict. Oxford, act so as to limit or undermine. Synonyms, break, encroach, weaken, disobey, meddle. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That means it shouldn't be limited, restricted, undermined, or weakened in any way. So when someone says, I support the Second Amendment, but, and then follows up with an argument for gun control, they're effectively nullifying their initial claim. You can't have it both ways. This common phrase, I support the Second Amendment, but, is often used by people trying to straddle the line between upholding gun rights and appeasing the ASDM crowd. They'll say things like, I believe in the right to own firearms, but we need more regulations. Or, I support the Second Amendment, but we should ban assault rifles. Here's the problem. The Second Amendment wasn't written with exceptions for certain types of firearms, for certain types of people, or for certain conditions. The founders knew exactly what they were doing when they chose the words shall not be infringed. The amendment isn't open to subjective interpretation or partial support. It's meant to protect a fundamental right, plain and simple. Gun rights are natural rights. To clarify, you don't need to be a die-hard constitutionalist to believe in gun rights. The right to self-defense is a natural right that belongs to every human being, regardless of political beliefs, race, religion, gender, or income. The Second Amendment simply enshrines that right into the fabric of our nation's laws. However, if you claim to support it and then call for limitations, your logic is inconsistent. When people use the but argument, they're imposing their own subjective standards on what should be an absolute right. It's not different from the ASDM crowd who decide at what level they think firearms should be regulated, despite the clear wording of the Second Amendment. In the end, either you support the Second Amendment as written, or you don't. There's no middle ground when it comes to fundamental rights. We put limits on free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. This argument is a classic red herring and a straw man fallacy, often used to divert from the actual issue of gun rights. It comes from a gross misunderstanding of both the nature of free speech limitations and the purpose of the Second Amendment. Let's break it down. The origin of the yelling fire argument. The phrase, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, originates from the 1919 Supreme Court case, Schenck versus United States. In this case, the court ruled against Charles Schenck, who was distributing anti-war pamphlets during World War I under the Espionage Act of 1917. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. coined the phrase in his opinion to explain why certain forms of speech, like falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic, are not protected under the First Amendment. What often gets lost in this reference is the context. The case was not about someone falsely shouting fire, but about political speech. Schenck was protesting the draft, something most people today would agree is a legitimate form of expression, regardless of their stance on the issue. The fire in a theater analogy was used to justify curtailing dissent, which should be concerning to anyone who values free speech. Later, this precedent was partially overturned in Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969, which established a stricter standard. Speech could only be limited if it is likely to incite imminent lawless action. Even Justice Holmes himself walked back his earlier statement, recognizing its overreach. The false equivalence with gun rights. Using the "you can't yell fire" analogy to justify gun control is deeply flawed. Here's why. Intent matters. The original analogy applies to speech that is intended to cause harm, like inciting panic in a theater. Gun ownership, on the other hand, is about possessing a tool for lawful purposes, such as self-defense, hunting, or sport. Just as free speech doesn't protect you if you use it to incite violence, the Second Amendment doesn't protect criminal actions taken with firearms. It protects the right to bear arms, not to commit crimes with them. Misunderstanding of rights. This argument implies that rights, such as those enshrined in the Constitution, are subject to arbitrary limitations. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech with specific exceptions, but it doesn't give the government carte blanche to regulate all speech. Similarly, the Second Amendment's "shall not be infringed" clause is a direct prohibition against government overreach in regulating firearms, irrelevance to gun control. The analogy assumes that gun ownership inherently leads to harm, just as falsely yelling fire might cause a stampede. This is an oversimplification and ignores the fact that millions of gun owners use their firearms responsibly every day. The vast majority of firearms are never used in crimes, just as the vast majority of speech does not incite violence. Limiting speech versus limiting arms. The First Amendment protects speech unless it directly causes harm, like inciting violence. The Second Amendment protects the right to own firearms unless they are used in a criminal manner. The analogy fails because it conflates use with possession. Possessing a firearm, just like possessing the ability to speak, does not inherently cause harm. The problem arises when either is misused. Holmes walked back the statement. Even Justice Holmes, the originator of the fire in a theater analogy, later reconsidered his stance. In later cases, he acknowledged that speech should only be limited when there is a clear and present danger that directly leads to illegal action. Similarly, the Second Amendment protects firearm ownership for legal, lawful purposes. Misusing that firearm, just like misusing speech, is not protected. A misguided argument. The yelling fire analogy is not a valid argument for restricting gun ownership. It's an overused and oversimplified example that doesn't apply to the debate over the Second Amendment. The analogy compares criminal misuse of a right, yelling fire to cause harm, to the mere possession of a firearm, which is a right guaranteed by the Constitution. No one is arguing that the Second Amendment protects criminal actions, only that it protects the right to own and carry arms for lawful purposes. In essence, the yelling fire in a crowded theater argument is a rhetorical distraction. It doesn't address the actual issue of whether the government has the authority to infringe upon the fundamental right to bear arms, just as it shouldn't infringe on the right to free speech. If anything, it highlights the danger of allowing the government to overreach in regulating rights, whether it's speech or gun ownership. Conclusion. Ultimately, this argument doesn't hold water. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, just as the First Amendment protects the right to free speech. Neither right should be subject to arbitrary limitations based on hypothetical scenarios. The analogy is not a valid justification for infringing on gun rights, just as it's not a valid reason to broadly restrict free speech. Less people are owning guns. When anti-gun groups push the idea that fewer people own guns, they are trying to normalize the notion that gun ownership is rare, strange, or out of step with modern society. By presenting gun ownership as something that only a shrinking minority engages in, they hope to dissuade others from purchasing firearms, using social pressure to achieve their goal. The purpose is to make gun ownership seem taboo, which could lead to fewer people wanting to associate with it. This tactic is meant to foster a cultural shift where firearms are seen as undesirable, even if people are not directly opposed to gun ownership itself. This mimetic pressure aims to shape behavior not through laws, but by making people feel that gun ownership is socially unacceptable or outdated. Debunking the claim. The data does not support the idea that fewer Americans are owning guns. Here's why. Rising gun sales, firearms sales have soared in recent years. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic and periods of civil unrest, gun sales hit record highs. According to the FBI, 2020 saw 39.7 million background checks, a huge increase over previous years. This surge included a large number of first-time gun buyers, which contradicts the narrative that gun ownership is declining. Increasing concealed carry permits. Concealed carry permits have increased dramatically from 4.6 million in 2007 to over 21 million by 2021. This is a 273% increase in concealed carry permits across the United States. What's even more significant is that this increase occurred alongside a growing number of states that allow permitless carry, which means that the actual number of people carrying firearms is likely even higher. Manufacturing data. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, reports that gun manufacturing has skyrocketed, particularly during the Obama administration. The number of firearms produced in the U.S. more than doubled between 2007 and 2016. This rise in production would not happen without an accompanying demand for firearms. Polling problems. Many of the statistics claiming a decline in gun ownership are based on polls, which have several issues. First, fewer people are willing to respond to polls or share personal information with strangers over the phone. Second, gun owners may be reluctant to disclose that they own firearms, especially in an increasingly polarized environment where gun owners are often portrayed as extremists or dangerous. This reluctance can lead to underreporting of gun ownership in surveys. Record growth of first-time gun owners. According to a National Shooting Sports Foundation (NSSF) report, an estimated 8.4 million Americans became first-time gun buyers in 2020 alone. This surge of new gun owners suggests that more people are embracing firearms rather than turning away from them. Why they push this narrative? The anti-gun movement pushes this narrative to influence public opinion and lawmakers by creating the perception that gun ownership is becoming less common and less socially acceptable. If people believe that fewer people own guns, they may be less likely to buy one themselves, thinking that they are in the minority or that they will be judged negatively by their peers. This tactic is also used to make politicians feel more comfortable supporting gun control measures by convincing them that fewer voters are gun owners. In summary, despite the claims made by anti-gun advocates, the data clearly shows that gun ownership in the U.S. is not only stable, but has been growing significantly. The narrative of declining gun ownership is a tactic to create social pressure and discourage people from exercising their Second Amendment rights. But it does not reflect the reality of firearm ownership in America.